The unexpected guest. Caroline's wooden spoon moved methodically through the pot of simmering pasta sauce, the rich aroma of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen. Soft jazz played softly from the small blue speaker perched on the windowsill, blending harmoniously with the occasional sound of birds chirping outside. The late afternoon sun cast warm golden streaks across the granite countertop, making the kitchen feel cozy and serene. It was just another Wednesday, ordinary, uneventful, predictable. Until it wasn't. The front door slammed open with an abrupt bang, shaking the stillness of the house. Caroline flinched, her hand jerking slightly, causing a dollop of sauce to splash onto the stove. "Mom! I'm home!" Tommy's familiar, energetic voice called out. "And I brought my friend." Caroline sighed, shaking her head with an amused smile. Tommy always came in like a whirlwind, loud and full of life, filling every corner of the house with his energy. She quickly turned down the stove's heat and wiped her hands on the apron tied around her waist. "Honey, how many times do I have to tell you not to slam the door like that?" she called out as she turned toward the hallway. "I didn't slam it." Tommy shot back, his voice coming closer. "It's windy today." Caroline rolled her eyes, still smiling. But as she stepped out of the kitchen to greet her son and his friend, the air in the room shifted. The moment her eyes landed on the boy standing beside Tommy, the world around her seemed to tilt. Her breath hitched. Her stomach clenched. Her heart stopped, then started pounding violently in her chest. It was as if time itself had played a cruel trick on her. The boy standing there looked exactly like him. The same unruly chestnut-brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, the same deep hazel eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and warmth. Even the way he stood, shoulders slightly slouched, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jeans, was identical. But what made Caroline's knees weaken was the small, crescent-shaped birthmark just below his left ear. Her legs trembled, and she clutched the doorway for support. No. It couldn't be. This wasn't possible. It had to be some bizarre coincidence. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The wooden spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. The sound echoed through the house, but she barely heard it. Her vision blurred. Her fingers trembled. The world felt suddenly suffocating. "Mom?" Tommy asked, concern lacing his voice. "Are you okay?" Caroline's lips parted, but her voice came out hoarse and shaky. Who is this?" Tommy glanced between his mother and his friend, confused. Mom, this is Dylan." He gestured toward the boy standing next to him. "My best friend from school. I told you about him, remember?" Dylan. That wasn't his name. That wasn't the name she had whispered into the darkness every night for years. That wasn't the name she had cried out when she searched the empty streets, praying to find him. But the face was the same. Caroline took an unsteady step forward, her hands shaking as she reached out. The boy, Dylan, tilted his head slightly, his brows furrowed in confusion. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Williams." His voice, too, was eerily familiar. Caroline sucked in a sharp breath. Her head spun. Matthew. Her Matthew. The son she had lost 10 years ago. Her vision blurred with tears, and before she could stop herself, a strangled sob escaped her lips. Dylan took a step back, his confusion growing into discomfort. Is something wrong?" Tommy looked between them, frowning. "Mom? What's going on?" Caroline blinked rapidly, forcing herself to breathe. She clutched her chest, feeling her heart pound like a drum. I'm sorry," she stammered. "It's just that, she swallowed hard. "You look exactly like someone I knew." Dylan gave her a hesitant smile. "Really? Who?" She hesitated, staring into those familiar hazel eyes. "My son," she whispered. Tommy's expression turned bewildered. "Wait, what?" "But, Mom, I'm your son." Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself before reopening them. "Before you were born, Tommy. I had another son." Tommy's eyes widened. "You never told me that." "Because it hurt too much. Because speaking about it felt like reopening a wound that had never truly healed." Caroline forced herself to look at Dylan again. "His name was Matthew," she murmured, the name barely making it past her lips without breaking. Dylan shifted awkwardly. "Oh. I'm sorry. What happened to him?" Caroline inhaled shakily, her throat tightening. He disappeared." Her voice cracked, and she clenched her fists. "When he was 4 years old, he was taken. And I never saw him again." Dylan stiffened slightly, something flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to say something but then hesitated. A moment of silence stretched between them. Tommy was the first to break it. "Wait, are you saying that Dylan might be my brother?" He laughed nervously, as if the idea were too ridiculous to consider. But Caroline wasn't laughing. Neither was Dylan. Instead, he was staring at her, his expression unreadable. Then, hesitantly, he lifted his hand and touched the small crescent birthmark below his left ear. I have this weird mark here," he murmured. "I always wondered where it came from." Caroline's breath hitched. That birthmark had been Matthew's. It had been there since the day he was born. A scar burned in her memory, an old, faded picture of her holding her son in her arms, kissing his tiny cheek right below that very mark. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was him. She was sure of it. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Dylan," she choked out, barely able to form words. Where did you grow up?" Dylan hesitated. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "I was adopted when I was 5. My adoptive parents told me they found me in a park alone. I didn't remember anything before that." Caroline's knees buckled. She staggered slightly, her head spinning. 5 years old. Matthew had disappeared at 4. Could it really be? Could this be the miracle she had stopped believing in? Or was she only chasing a ghost? She took another step closer, reaching for him as a sob racked her body. And Dylan, who had always believed he was just another ordinary boy, stood frozen, watching a woman he had never met before cry as if she had been waiting for him all her life. Tommy looked between them, his mind struggling to process what was happening. And then, in a voice so small, so uncertain, Dylan asked a question that changed everything. "What if I am Matthew?" Unraveling the past. A thick silence fell over the room. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant honking of a car outside, and Caroline's ragged breathing as she stared at Dylan, Matthew, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to believe what was happening. Her mind was a hurricane of emotions. For 10 years, she had lived with a hole in her heart, a void that could never be filled. She had memorized every detail of her son's face, his little mannerisms, the way he used to tug on her shirt when he wanted to be picked up, the way his laughter filled their tiny house like the sweetest melody. And now, standing before her, was a boy who bore the same face, the same voice, the same birthmark. Could it really be him? Or was this just some cruel, twisted coincidence? Tommy's nervous laughter broke the silence. Guys? This is kind of weird. Are we saying Dylan is, like, my long-lost brother or something?" He gave his friend a skeptical look. "Dude, that would be insane." Dylan, Matthew, rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, his mind racing. "I don't know," he admitted. "I mean, it's not impossible, right? If I was adopted and don't remember anything before that." Caroline's hands trembled as she reached for the nearest chair and sank into it. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Can you tell me anything about your childhood? Anything at all before you were adopted?" Dylan hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. "I don't remember much," he said slowly. "Just flashes of things sometimes. Like, I used to have this weird dream when I was little. It was always the same." Caroline's pulse quickened. "What kind of dream?" Dylan's brow furrowed as he tried to recall. "I was really small, and there was this warm light. I think it was the sun. And I was sitting on the grass, playing with some toy cars." He paused. "There was a woman. I couldn't see her face, but I remember she had a soft voice. She was laughing. And she smelled like flowers." Caroline clapped a hand over her mouth, her body shaking. She had spent countless afternoons in the backyard with Matthew, watching him play with his toy cars in the grass while she sat beside him, her arms wrapped around her knees, laughing at his excitement. She always wore the same floral-scented perfume. "Oh my God," she gasped. Tears spilled from her eyes. Tommy's jaw dropped. "No way." Dylan shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his arms as if he were suddenly cold. "I always thought it was just a random dream. But it felt real." He looked at Caroline, his eyes filled with something almost like recognition. "Do you think that could be a memory?" Caroline nodded, unable to contain her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I do." Dylan swallowed hard. "But if I really am your son, how did I end up with my adoptive parents?" His voice dropped. "Where was I all those years?" That was the question that sent a cold chill down Caroline's spine. She inhaled shakily and wiped her tears, forcing herself to focus. If this was real, if this was truly Matthew, then someone had taken him. Someone had stolen him away from her. And she needed to find out who. She looked up at Dylan with fierce determination. "Do you remember where your adoptive parents found you?" Dylan nodded. "They told me I was found alone in a park. A woman brought me to the police, saying she saw me wandering by myself. I didn't have any ID, no family records. Just a first name, Matthew." Caroline felt her breath catch in her throat. "Matthew?" she echoed. Dylan nodded. "Yeah, but the police couldn't find any records of a missing child named Matthew who matched my description. So, they put me in foster care." He hesitated. "My adoptive parents changed my name to Dylan when they officially adopted me." Caroline's heart ached. "They changed your name," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dylan shrugged. "Yeah, they said it would help me move forward, since I didn't remember anything from before." His expression softened. "They're good people. They took care of me." Caroline blinked away tears. She wasn't angry at his adoptive parents. They had saved him, given him a home when the system had failed her. But someone had taken him before that. Someone had erased his past. And Caroline needed to know who. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Dylan, would you be willing to take a DNA test?" she asked carefully. "I know this is a lot to ask, but, if we do the test, we can know for sure." Dylan hesitated, his fingers twitching. "You really think I might be your son?" His voice was small, uncertain. Caroline nodded. "Yes." Dylan exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he nodded. "Okay. Let's do it." Tommy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Dude, if you're actually my brother. That would be wild." Dylan smirked. "Yeah. It would." But beneath his light-hearted tone, his eyes were filled with something deeper, fear, hope, and an ache for answers. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a boy who had been found alone in a park. He was someone's son. And that truth, once uncovered, would change everything. 2 days later, the DNA test arrives. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping anxiously against the surface. The envelope sat in front of her, untouched. Her whole body trembled. She had spent the last 2 days unable to think about anything else. Memories of Matthew had flooded her mind, invading her dreams, making sleep impossible. She had barely eaten, barely spoken. Because this piece of paper, was the moment that could either give her back what she had lost or shatter her all over again. Dylan sat across from her, his hands clasped together tightly. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. Tommy, sitting beside him, was unusually quiet. Caroline inhaled deeply. Then, with trembling hands, she picked up the envelope and tore it open. Her eyes scanned the paper. Her breath caught. Her heart slammed against her ribs. 99.99% match. Her hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her lips. Dylan tensed. What does it say? She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. It's you, she whispered. You're my son. Dylan's eyes widened. I am. Caroline burst into sobs. Yes. Dylan stared at her, his face pale. He swallowed hard, trying to process the reality of it. So, all this time, his voice cracked. Caroline couldn't wait any longer. She surged forward, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tightly as her body shook with years of pain, grief, and love that had never faded. And after a long moment, Dylan, Matthew, slowly wrapped his arms around her, too. For the first time in 10 years, he was home. But the mystery was far from over. Because now, Caroline needed to know who had stolen her son. And she wouldn't stop until she found out. The DNA test, a truth that changes everything. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in on them as the weight of the moment settled. The sound of the ticking clock on the wall filled the room, its rhythm amplifying the anticipation and disbelief swirling between them. Caroline sat frozen, the DNA results clenched in her trembling hands. The words blurred before her tear-filled eyes, but she didn't need to read them again. 99.99% match. It was real. It wasn't just a wild hope, a coincidence, or a trick of fate. The boy sitting across from her, the boy who had walked into her home like an ordinary guest, was her son. Her Matthew. Tears streamed down her face as she slowly looked up, locking eyes with Dylan. No, Matthew. He stared back at her, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if grounding himself. I'm your son, he whispered, as if saying the words out loud would make them feel more real. Caroline nodded, a choked sob escaping her lips. Yes. You are. Tommy sat to the side, his mouth slightly open. His gaze bounced between his mother and his best friend, his brother. This is insane, Tommy finally blurted, shaking his head. Like. Dylan, Matthew, whatever, you're my actual brother? Dylan, Matthew, let out a shaky breath and leaned back in his chair. I guess so. He ran his fingers through his hair. This is crazy. Caroline reached across the table, placing her hands over his. I know this must be overwhelming for you, sweetheart, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But I need you to know, I never stopped looking for you. Not for 1 second. I thought I lost you forever. And now, you're here. Matthew swallowed hard. I don't even know what to say. His voice cracked slightly. This whole time, I thought I was just some random kid who got left behind. I never thought I had a family out there looking for me. Caroline felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her. Left behind? That was what he thought had happened to him? That he had been abandoned? She reached out and cupped his face with both hands. No, sweetheart. You were never abandoned. You were taken from me. Matthew's body stiffened. Tommy frowned. Wait. So, if Dylan, wasn't abandoned, then who took him? That was the question burning in all their minds. Caroline's jaw tightened. That's what I intend to find out. Digging into the past. The next morning, Caroline sat in the dim glow of her home office, a stack of old police reports and newspaper clippings spread across her desk. The clock read 3:27 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on her mind. After Dylan, Matthew, had gone home for the night, the shock of the DNA results had turned into something else. An all-consuming need for answers. She dug through every document she had kept since the day Matthew had disappeared, police reports, missing child flyers, notes from private investigators. Her fingers trembled as she traced over the yellowed edges of a newspaper clipping from 10 years ago. Local mother desperate to find missing son, toddler vanishes without a trace. Her heart clenched. The article had been written just weeks after Matthew had gone missing from the playground near their old home. She could still hear the way her own voice had cracked as she begged on TV for someone, anyone, to bring her son home. But no one had. The police had searched, but there were no witnesses, no security footage, no leads. Eventually, the case had gone cold. But now, Matthew was back. And she was determined to uncover what had happened to him. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. Someone had stolen her son. Someone had raised him under a different name. And someone had lied. She took a deep breath and pulled out the most important document, the adoption records Dylan's adoptive parents had given him. They had always told him they had adopted him through a legal agency after he had been found alone in a park. But the details in the file didn't add up. The adoption papers were incomplete. There was no birth certificate. No official caseworker report on how Dylan had entered the foster system. It was as if his life before the age of 5 had been erased. Caroline's heart pounded. Something wasn't right. She needed to talk to his adoptive parents. Meeting the adoptive parents. Later that day, Caroline stood outside a modest suburban home, her hands clammy as she rang the doorbell. Matthew had reluctantly given her their address, but he had also warned her, they didn't know anything about this. Please don't be mad at them. She wasn't angry at them. She was angry at whoever had lied to them. The door creaked open, and an older woman with graying hair and gentle eyes stepped out. She looked wary at first, but then her expression softened with recognition. You must be Caroline, she said quietly. Caroline swallowed hard. Yes. Her voice caught. I'm Matthew's mother. The woman's eyes filled with sadness. I know. She stepped aside, motioning for Caroline to enter. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with framed pictures and the faint scent of vanilla candles. Matthew's adoptive father sat on the couch, his expression solemn. We had a feeling this day might come, he admitted as Caroline sat down across from them. Caroline clenched her hands together. Please, tell me everything you know. How did you find him? The adoptive mother sighed. It was about 10 years ago. A woman brought him to a police station and claimed she had found him alone in a park. The police ran a search but found no missing child records matching him. No last name. No relatives. Nothing. Caroline's stomach twisted. And the woman, she pressed. The one who brought him in. The couple exchanged glances. She disappeared, the adoptive father said. No one could track her down. It was like she didn't exist. Caroline's breath hitched. Someone had deliberately erased Matthew's identity. And she was going to find out who. A new lead, and a dangerous truth. That night, Caroline sat with Matthew and Tommy, going over every detail of his adoption story. Then, something clicked. "The woman who found you," Caroline said, leaning forward. "Do you remember anything about her?" Matthew frowned, searching his memory. "I don't know. I think she had a bracelet." Caroline's heart pounded. "What kind of bracelet?" Matthew squinted. "It had a bird on it. A hummingbird, I think." Caroline's blood ran cold. She knew exactly who had worn a bracelet like that. A former babysitter. A woman who had worked at the daycare Matthew had attended as a child. A woman the police had questioned once, but had never considered a suspect. Her name was Linda Carter. And Caroline had a feeling that she was about to uncover a truth far darker than she ever could have imagined. Because whoever had taken Matthew, had wanted him to disappear forever. And now that he had been found, would they try to take him again? The Truth Revealed, extended and unique version. Caroline sat in her dimly lit living room, her mind racing as she clutched a faded photograph in her hands. The image was of a younger version of herself, standing in the park with Matthew when he was just a toddler. His tiny hands clutched a red toy car, his eyes bright and full of life. That was the last picture taken before he vanished. And now, after 10 years of grief, emptiness, and unanswered prayers, she finally had the key to the truth. Linda Carter. The name sent a chill down her spine. Linda had worked at the daycare where Matthew used to go. She had been kind, soft-spoken, and seemingly harmless. But now, all of the strange little details that Caroline had overlooked back then came flooding back. How Linda had been overly attached to Matthew, how she had always volunteered to walk him outside, how she had quit her job just weeks after Matthew disappeared. Could it have been her all along? Caroline's fists clenched around the photograph. She needed to find Linda. And she needed to do it before it was too late. A visit to the past. The next morning, Caroline drove across town to the daycare where Linda had once worked. The building had changed over the years, but the memories came rushing back the moment she stepped inside. A receptionist greeted her at the front desk. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Caroline took a deep breath. "I used to bring my son here. I was wondering if you have any records of past employees from about 10 years ago?" The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "We don't usually give out that kind of information, ma'am." Caroline clenched her jaw. "Please. This is important." The woman hesitated, then glanced around before lowering her voice. "Are you talking about Linda Carter?" Caroline's heart pounded. "Yes. Do you know where she is now?" The receptionist frowned. "I don't, but you're not the first person to ask about her." Caroline's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The receptionist leaned in. "A few months ago, someone else came looking for her. A man. He was asking a lot of questions about a missing child." Caroline's pulse quickened. "Did he leave a name?" The woman shook her head. "No. But he seemed desperate. Almost like he was afraid of something." Caroline's stomach churned. She needed to find Linda, now. A name from the shadows. That evening, Caroline sat in her car outside an old apartment complex on the edge of town. It had taken hours of digging, phone calls, and tracing old employment records, but she had finally found her lead. Linda Carter lived here. She clutched the steering wheel, taking a deep breath. If Linda was truly involved in Matthew's disappearance, what would she say? Would she even admit to it? Would she be dangerous? Shaking off her fears, Caroline stepped out of the car and made her way to the door. She knocked. A long silence stretched between each heartbeat. Then, the door cracked open, revealing a tired-looking woman with graying hair and sharp, wary eyes. "Linda," Caroline said, her voice firm. Linda stiffened. Who are you? Caroline took a step forward. You know who I am. Linda's grip tightened on the doorknob, but she didn't shut the door. I just want to talk, Caroline continued, her voice trembling slightly. About my son. Linda flinched. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, she stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. The shocking confession. The inside of the apartment was small and cluttered. Old newspapers were stacked on the coffee table, and faded curtains let in only slivers of light. Caroline sat down, her hands clenched into fists. Tell me the truth. Did you take Matthew? Linda's eyes darted away. I never wanted to hurt you, she murmured. Caroline's breath hitched. So you did take him? Linda swallowed hard. I didn't kidnap him. I saved him. Caroline's body went rigid. Saved him? From what? Linda looked haunted, like a woman with ghosts clinging to her. She rubbed her arms as if she were cold. The man who was looking for me? He wasn't a stranger. He was Matthew's real kidnapper. Caroline's blood turned to ice. What? She whispered. Linda exhaled shakily. 10 years ago, I found him. A man had taken him, he was using him for. I don't know what, but it wasn't good. I overheard something one night when I was at a gas station outside town. I saw Matthew in the back seat of a car. He was crying. Caroline covered her mouth, horror washing over her. Linda continued, her voice hoarse. I knew I had to get him out. So. I waited. The man left him alone in the car for just a moment. I acted fast, I opened the door, grabbed Matthew, and ran. Caroline's vision blurred. She had imagined 1,000 possibilities for what had happened to her son, but this? Linda wiped at her eyes. I was afraid to go to the police. I had a criminal record from years before, and I knew they wouldn't believe me. So I took him as far away as I could. I dropped him off at a park and told someone I'd found him there, hoping he'd get adopted by a good family. Caroline's voice trembled. Why didn't you tell them who he really was? Linda's gaze darkened. Because that man, he was powerful. Dangerous. And he was still looking for him. Caroline felt as if she were suffocating. Who was he? Linda hesitated, then whispered, a man named Victor Reynolds. Caroline's stomach dropped. She had heard that name before, on the police reports. He had been a suspect in several missing child cases. A man with a history of human trafficking. And now, knowing that he had targeted her son. Her body shook with rage. A race against time. Caroline stood outside Linda's apartment, gripping her phone. She had already called the police, given them Linda's statement, and demanded they reopen the case. But she knew this wasn't over. If Victor Reynolds had been looking for Matthew all these years, would he try to take him again? She had to warn Matthew. She had to protect him. Because the past wasn't just resurfacing. It was coming for them. And this time, she would not lose her son again. The search for answers. Caroline's fingers trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The conversation with Linda Carter replayed in her mind like a broken record. Victor Reynolds. A name buried deep in cold case files. A man suspected in multiple child trafficking rings, yet he had always managed to slip through the cracks. And now, she knew, he was the one who had taken Matthew. The thought made her stomach churn. Had Matthew been in danger all these years? Had this monster tried to find him again? And if he had, was he still looking for him now? A cold chill ran down Caroline's spine as she pulled into her driveway. She needed to tell Matthew and Tommy the truth. She needed to make sure Matthew was safe. But something in her gut told her that this nightmare wasn't over. A warning too late. Caroline pushed open the front door, her heart pounding. "Tommy! Matthew!" she called out. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Panic surged through her veins as she dropped her bag and rushed through the hallway. The living room was empty. The kitchen, empty. She ran to Tommy's room, throwing open the door. No one. Then, she turned to Matthew's room, the guest room where he had been staying since discovering the truth. The door was slightly ajar, and her stomach clenched as she pushed it open. The bed was unmade, the blanket half-draped over the edge. Matthew's backpack was gone. A single piece of paper sat on the nightstand. With shaking hands, Caroline picked it up. Went to get food with Tommy. Be back soon. Her breath came in sharp gasps. No. No, no, no. Something was wrong. Matthew never left without telling her, not since they'd learned the truth. And Tommy, for all his carelessness, wouldn't have left a note if everything was normal. Caroline's mind raced. What if it wasn't Matthew who wrote this? Her body went cold. She fumbled for her phone and dialed Tommy's number. Ring. 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 No answer. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she called Matthew next. Straight to voicemail. Tears welled in her eyes as she fought the rising terror inside her. They were gone. And she knew, deep in her soul, this was not a coincidence. Victor Reynolds had found them. The kidnapper's game. Caroline didn't waste a second. She ran back to her car, barely registering that she hadn't locked the front door. Her hands shook as she called the police. "My sons are missing," she gasped. "They were here, now they're gone. You need to help me. I think someone took them." The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, we need details. When was the last time you saw them?" Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. "Less than an hour ago. They left a note, but something feels wrong. I think it's connected to a man named Victor Reynolds. He's a known criminal, he kidnapped my son 10 years ago. Please, please, you need to find them." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "We're sending officers now. Stay on the line." Caroline barely heard the rest of the conversation. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had one thought. Find them before it's too late. Tommy's fear. Somewhere in the back of a dark, moving van, Tommy struggled against the zip ties around his wrists. His pulse pounded in his ears as he twisted his hands, trying to free himself. Beside him, Matthew sat frozen, his breathing uneven. Tommy's voice shook. What is this? Who are these guys?" Matthew swallowed hard. "I don't know. But I think," his voice hitched. "I think it has something to do with me." Tommy's mind spun. The last thing he remembered was walking down the street with Matthew, heading toward a burger place. A black SUV had pulled up alongside them, and before he could react, 2 men had jumped out, yanking them inside. No one had seen. No one had heard. Now they were trapped. A rough voice growled from the front of the van. "Keep quiet, both of you." Tommy flinched, his body tense. He turned to Matthew, whispering, "Dude, what if they're the ones who took you before?" Matthew's hands trembled. "I think they are." The words hung between them like a curse. And then the van came to a sudden stop. A moment later, the doors swung open. And a man stepped inside. A man with cold, calculating eyes. A man with a scar running down the side of his jaw. A man named Victor Reynolds. A mother's fury. Caroline sat in the police station, her fingers gripping a cup of untouched coffee. Hours had passed. The officers had taken her statement. They had begun tracking Tommy's and Matthew's phones, both were switched off. And worst of all, there were no witnesses. Every second that passed felt like a knife twisting deeper into her chest. Then, an officer walked in. "Mrs. Williams?" Caroline shot to her feet. "Did you find them?" The officer's expression was grim. "We have a lead." She clutched her chest, barely able to breathe. "Where?" The officer hesitated. "There was a black SUV caught on traffic cameras about 6 blocks from your home. We tracked it to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town." Caroline didn't wait. "Take me there." "Ma'am, we can't allow civilians." "I don't care," she snapped. "Take me there now." The officer hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. The final confrontation. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted metal walls standing like a fortress of secrets. The police car came to a screeching halt outside, red and blue lights flashing against the darkness. Caroline barely heard the officer's commands as she jumped out of the car. She saw the black SUV parked nearby. Her heart pounded as she ran toward the entrance. Gunshots rang out in the distance. A cry of pain. Then, a scream. "Mom!" Matthew's voice. Caroline didn't hesitate. With a strength she didn't know she had, she ran. Into the darkness. Into the unknown. To save her sons. And she wouldn't stop. Not until they were safe. Not until Victor Reynolds was gone. Not until she brought Matthew, her son, home for good. Because this time, she would not lose him again. The final rescue and a new beginning. The warehouse smelled of rust, oil, and something more sinister, fear. The dim, flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows against the metal walls. Caroline's breath came in short gasps as she moved forward, her hands clenched into fists. She had spent 10 years grieving her son. She was not about to lose him again. Behind her, armed police officers moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Guns drawn, eyes sharp, they signaled for her to stay back. But she couldn't. Not when she could hear Matthew's voice, her son's voice, crying out from somewhere deeper inside. A scream pierced the silence. "Mom!" Caroline didn't think, she ran. Trapped in the darkness. Inside a locked storage room, Matthew and Tommy huddled together, their hands still bound behind their backs. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Tommy's forehead was slick with sweat as he tried, yet again, to loosen the zip ties around his wrists. "Dude, I swear, when we get out of here, I'm never leaving the house again," he muttered. Matthew's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. He could still see Victor Reynolds' face, the coldness in his eyes, the smirk on his lips as he'd told them, "Your mother should have stopped looking for you. Now, she'll regret it." The words made his stomach twist. His mother, she was in danger because of him. Matthew clenched his jaw. He had been stolen from his family once before. He would not let it happen again. A sudden bang outside made both boys flinch. Gunshots. Shouting. And then, a voice. "Matthew." His breath caught. It was her. "Mom," he shouted back, his voice hoarse. Tommy kicked at the door. "We're in here." Footsteps pounded toward them. A sharp bang sounded as someone shot the lock. The door burst open, revealing Caroline. Her eyes landed on Matthew, and the relief in her face shattered into raw emotion. "Matthew." She rushed forward, grabbing his face between her shaking hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Matthew's throat tightened. For 10 years, he had dreamed of what it would be like to be found. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. He collapsed into his mother's arms, his body trembling. "I thought I lost you," he choked out. Caroline held him tighter. "Never. I never stopped looking for you." Tommy cleared his throat. Guys? I love a good family reunion, but can we leave before that psycho comes back?" Caroline's expression hardened. She turned. Because this wasn't over. The final showdown. As they stepped into the main part of the warehouse, the scene was chaotic. Police officers swarmed the area, some taking down armed men who had clearly been working for Victor. And then, a single gunshot rang out. Caroline barely had time to react before a figure emerged from the shadows. Victor Reynolds. His face twisted in fury, his gun still smoking from the shot he had just fired at one of the officers. His eyes locked onto Matthew. His prize. "You," he spat, his voice like poison. "You were supposed to disappear." Caroline stepped in front of her son. "You will not touch him." Victor sneered. "I already did." He took a slow step forward. "And guess what, sweetheart? I can do it again." The rage that had been simmering in Caroline for 10 years ignited. Without thinking, she lunged. With everything in her. Victor barely had time to react before Caroline punched him. Hard. A sickening crack echoed through the warehouse as her fist connected with his jaw. The man stumbled back, his gun clattering to the ground. And then, an officer tackled him from behind, slamming him against the cold concrete. Victor grunted as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "Victor Reynolds," the officer growled, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking, and about a dozen other charges that'll make sure you never see daylight again." Caroline didn't hear the rest. She turned back to Matthew, her breath coming in shaky gasps. He was safe. For the first time in 10 years, her son was safe. And Victor Reynolds would never take him away again. A new beginning. Days later, Caroline sat on the front porch with Matthew and Tommy, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air smelled like fresh rain, and for the first time in a long time, Caroline felt like she could breathe. Matthew was here. With her. Home. Tommy nudged Matthew playfully. "So, you're officially my brother now. How do you feel about that?" Matthew smirked. "Well, considering you snore like a chainsaw. I think I want a refund." Caroline laughed, a real, genuine laugh, something she hadn't done in years. Matthew turned to her, his expression soft. "Mom?" She met his gaze. "Yes, sweetheart." He hesitated, then said, "I still don't remember everything. But I know this is where I belong." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. She reached over and took his hand. That's all that matters. For the first time in a decade, their family was whole again. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because Matthew was finally home.